Sejam todos bem-vindos ao podcast Descomplicando as Finanças Sustentáveis, uma série de 8 episódios dedicados ao tema das finanças sustentáveis. Este podcast é resultado de uma parceria entre o Jornal Económico, o Centro de Finanças Sustentáveis do ISEG e a Embaixada do Reino Unido em Lisboa. Através de conversas com interlocutores britânicos e portugueses com reconhecido trabalho na área das finanças sustentáveis, nosso objetivo é tornar o tema ainda mais acessível e destacar o papel do setor financeiro no combate às mudanças climáticas. Eu sou Flávia Lima, adida em Clima e Energia para a Embaixada do Reino Unido, e hoje nós vamos conversar com o Sean Kidney. Eu vou mudar para inglês, pois o Sean fala inglês. So, welcome, Sean. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you for being here to talk to us about sustainable finance.
Thank you for the invitation to talk.
So, Sean, I'll start by asking if you could explain to the listeners what a climate resilient economy is.
Well, a climate resilient economy is exactly as it sounds. It's one that is resilient to climate. I mean, look, we have two things going on here. We have very clear science now that not only tells us about climate change, which we've known about for a long time, but tells us something rather scary, that we have lost the fight against climate change. It's now certain we can't stop it. 1.5 degrees will happen in the next few years, global warming above the original baseline. And realistically, we're going to get to 2 to 2.5 degrees warming. This is extremely dangerous because we don't really know what happens to the planet at 2.5 degrees warming. But I want to stress that that's gone now. And so we have to prepare for that. We have to become more resilient. Our goal on the mitigation side, on getting emissions down, is now a little humbler. It's about how to stabilize the world's climate at about 1.5 degree warming with a lot of sequestration. A lot. So over the next 25 years, we are going to have to way increase the level of CO2 captured in different sorts of ways. So how do we do that? The first way is with forestry growth. We need to retire a lot of the soya plants in Brazil, the plantations, and put them back to forest. But we also need to do this in the US. We need to do this in tropical zones and temperate zones around the world, not in the north. We don't need more forests in Siberia or Canada because that actually changes the albedo effect. It turns the ground from white tundra to green forest that absorbs more heat. But in areas where we can, we need 50% growth in forest cover globally. That's one. Two is we need to change our soil practices, our agricultural farming, from practices that release carbon to practices that sequester carbon. For example, zero tilling, putting a seed in with a needle rather than ploughing the soil, is becoming dominant in some richer countries, but now needs to be dominant everywhere. Plus the change of crops, maize corn is not very good for sequestration, releases carbon, whereas quinoa, which they grow so much in Peru, is really good. So we've got to be thinking about our cropping so that we make sure we absorb. And livestock will be a problem. 80% of the land we farm is put to either livestock or food for livestock globally. This is an unsupportable percentage. We are going to have to retire much of that land, which means a different approach to livestock management. And apart from slowly reducing our meat coverage, being careful about that, which is going to be very difficult for a Brazilian barbecue, I have to say. But we also need to look at changing the way we produce meat, make it much more sustainable, more intense. In Brazil, we have the scope of increasing the productivity of our cattle ranches with investment and reducing the need for fresh land. These are things we have to tackle because we've got to reforest. So that's just the agricultural space. On the mitigation space, the energy space, we can reuse CO2 and suck it out of the atmosphere. Direct air capture, which is sequestering carbon out of the soil, is going to be essential. So that's one side of it. There's the whole and that mitigation side. That's the minimum we need to do to meet our carbon goals. 55% reductions globally by 2030 is not a target. It's actually the minimum. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change says we need to get to have a chance of maintaining a stable atmosphere going forward. And we need to, as I said earlier, prepare. Things are going to get grim. The last 30 years have seen an increase in emissions in the atmosphere from deforestation, from industrial production, from coal plants, which have meant more emissions have been put in the atmosphere than in the previous 150 years. The latency effect is 30 years, so the climate we are feeling now, there were droughts and snow in the wrong season, or floods in Pakistan. These are essentially impacts from emissions from more than 30 years ago. Now, if you think we've actually more than doubled the amount of emissions since then, even if we stop stone cold tomorrow morning, which is not going to happen, we are going to have increasingly volatile weather for the next 30 years. We have to prepare. Sea level rise are going up. There is a risk at the moment that the West Antarctic ice shelf might collapse quite quickly, along with the Greenland ice shelf, which will triggers off feedback loops down the world, including, by the way, a risk of the Amazon rapidly degrading to become more like savanna. It's one of the risks we're trying to figure at the moment, which means there's a risk, and this is all risk, right? There's a risk, but it's a substantial risk of increased sea level rises way above the meter that is currently been predicted for 2050. I mean, Ipanema Beach is going to become a different kind of beach quite soon. But if the West Antarctic ice shelf collapses, we're looking at many meters of increase of. So there's that kind of thing. How do we actually prepare? How do we make sure that Santos, the port, is ready for the change coming through? We need to bring up the height of all the wharves as a basic level. We need to be getting ready for crazy weather. We are going to get things like the heat dome in British Columbia happening. Heat is going to be the biggest risk. In some places, like in Uttar Pradesh in India, there's a high risk of substantial long-term heat that will kill many millions of people. In fact, I'm on record as saying we're going to see mass death happening in different places by 2030. It might be Alabama, one of the highest risk areas going forward. So that's what we're looking at now, folks. So let's prepare. It's not just physical. Our societies have to be prepared. We need social resilience. We need stronger communities that can survive crises. In San Francisco, with research on resilience, they've discovered that the strength of a community is worth about 40% of the ability of the community to survive after an earthquake. So they've started investing in the city council in block parties, giving grants for people in communities to hold parties with the condition that they have to invite every single person in the block, including the disabled person upstairs and the grumpy old man on the top floor, so that everyone knows everyone. Because once everyone knows everyone, when there is a crisis, people get rescued more often and survive better, and people know each other. So this is social resilience, folks, but also wealth. If you've got a bit of money and a bit of savings, you've got more chance of surviving a crazy crisis. And the governments can provide money. Look at what happened with this crazy global experiment in how to survive or not survive a crisis we've just run with the pandemic, where in some countries, people have survived really well. I've just been in Japan, an incredibly successful survival. Brazil was not one of the ones that survived well. We lost a lot of our family members when we did not need to. So we've got to learn from those and figure out what kind of society to build, what kind of responses to have in place. It's social resilience, it's economic resilience. I'll give you just a little example to finish off my story. If we want resilient financial systems and economic and social systems, we have to invest in the primary education of women. Because when we educate women, they have more choices. They start small businesses. It changes the fabric of the economy. It improves inequality in the economy. It reduces inequality. And equality, the level of equality you have, is the prime predictor of the resilience of a society. With another benefit is that for central banks who are concerned about financial stability, when you lend to small businesses run by women, your default rate in places where this has been researched is like 3%. When you lend to small businesses set up by men, the default rate is like 20%. That just means, did you know that for the Banco Central, the education of women is a financial stability requirement? All of these things need to be understood now, which is really the SDGs have a little bit of a stronger evidence base, the sustainable development goals, to create a world where we all have more chance of surviving what is now going to become crisis after crisis after crisis.
So,
we've seen nothing yet.
So you mentioned a grim scenario in which we're going to be facing, as was said in Davos, poly-crisis, not just crisis in the economy, but also related to climate change that are getting crazier and crazier as we progress towards 2030 and the 2050, those targets that collectively the countries have decided that makes sense to have targets in reducing the CO2 emissions. But you also mentioned what's going to happen and how we can change. You mentioned some examples of how we can change that. But
so it's important to note we've got options here. We are not free of
options. But it's a lot of money. It is investments. Yeah. So how we can invest on that?
Flavia, that's the key word. You just said it, the golden word. It's investment. Most of what we have to do is not expenditure, it's investment. When it comes down to energy systems, industrial systems, or agriculture, for a minute, we can do the bulk, what we need to do, with capital investment that will get returns, as long as we have the right procurement guidelines to make sure we address risk like adaptation risk. And that's the opportunity for us here, for the nature of Brazilian agribusiness or industry or urban development for that matter. If we invest in the right kinds of assets, it will improve our resilience and also make us more profitable. We do know that already the application of capital to agriculture production in Brazil has demonstrably improved the productivity. It's very clear. More capital allocated. That's one of the things that lots of small farmers, it's tricky to make the money flow work. That's what people like Banco do Brasil are working on. That investment is large. According to a study by McKinsey a year ago, we need to be investing globally about $9.2 trillion a year. That is a lot of money. The
that is a lot of money.
The US economy is about $18 trillion in GDP, gives you a sense. But we have one thing going for us that makes me think we are in the faces of crisis, in the faces of this freight train coming down the line at us, which is focusing our minds. It makes me think we're lucky, which is we have capital. On the planet, we have more capital now than ever before in history. It's not always in the right place, but at least it's there, So when we've got this big, let's call it a capital expenditure lump, capital investment lump we've got to do, we've got the capital we can mobilize and we know how to mobilize. So we've been doing it for 200 years, building our economies. We haven't been applying it as a particular problem. But if you think about it, all it is a planning issue, making sure that we plan, in Sao Paulo, urban planning needs to be focused on very energy efficient buildings. That's a procurement requirement in a regulatory setting. If you do it in the design stage, it's very cheap. You just make it a minimum requirement. And a bit like in Tokyo now, it is illegal to build a building unless you're earthquake proof. Same principle. So we can do all of that. We know that if we invest in clean energy, it becomes cheaper. The more you invest, the more it becomes cheaper, as we've seen with the incredible drop in solar over the last 20 years, which is now cheaper than pretty well anything else anywhere in the world now. We've just got to find the land and all that sort of stuff. And wind is becoming cheaper. So we know we can do all of these things. We need to stop doing some things because that diverts us. We're currently in a fossil fuel price boom because of the war in Ukraine, because of the petrostate war, which is essentially a petrostate dictator invading a state by using fossil fuel revenues from Europe to do it. That's what it is. And of course, now we're beginning to understand that Putin has been actively sabotaging climate efforts in the political discussions of many countries for many years as a way of protecting their oil revenues. So it's a really classic example of the kind of conflict that's going to arise as we see this big change to a new society. We need to speed up the shift towards green and stop the shift now with money being invested in new oil and gas deposits which are going to be harmful to the world, the International Energy Agency says any new investment in fossil fuels means we cannot meet our 1.5 degrees Celsius targets. Any new, you know, sweating and getting rid of the ones we have now will be differential. Emerging markets will have longer to do it than rich countries, but new anywhere, it's not right, which means all of those Petrobras oil fields up the coast, we can't develop them, which also applies to the US, it applies to Russia, applies to China, applies everywhere from a climate perspective. Now, people are developing them, and like, this is the crazy thing. I was in Mumbai last week and I woke up in my hotel, looked out, and there was a gas rig anchored off the coast there, up to one of the biggest cities in the world. And I just thought, what are we doing? We are still expanding exactly the thing that is killing us as a species. And make no mistake, if we get runaway climate change, which is if we don't meet our 2030 IPCC targets, that's what we're going to see. That's going to be 6 to 8 degrees Celsius. It is not at all certain that it's a climate the world humans can survive in unless they live in underground silos with controlled air circulation. Because we're talking about making the density of GHGs in the atmosphere, greenhouse gases, quadruple what they are now. Humans have never been on this planet with those levels of concentration. We don't know whether the species is going to adapt. What I can tell you for certain, a lot of people will die. It's not a future we want our children to be part of. So, there is this kind of shocking understanding, lack of understanding between what we need to do and what we're still doing. But as I said, if we make the change, just think about this, $9.2 trillion a year, that would be the largest capital investment boom in the history of humanity. If we do it, knowing we've got the capital, we can do it with things like blended finance or regulatory measures. When Europe banned incandescent light bulbs, it suddenly made LED light bulb companies a really good investment. Same idea. We can do this sort of stuff around the world. If we do it, it will create a boom. We're seeing the beginning of the boom now because of the change in renewable energy and electric vehicles, which are in themselves climate contributions. There's a commodities boom building. Any country that is not thinking about the future commodities boom and is still wrapped on the old commodities, like oil and gas, is making a terrible mistake for their own economic growth. Lithium in Chile, in Bolivia, in Argentina.
And also in Portugal as well.
In Portugal, Flavia, there you go.
Yeah, the biggest lithium reserves are here in Portugal, actually.
Wow, I had no idea. Isn't that incredible?
In Europe, so, the biggest Europe reserves of lithium are here in Portugal. Yeah.
So we've got to start thinking about this. What are the commodities we need, which will help us make the transition, knowing there's business? My line for banks and governments around the world, this is not about putting on a hair shirt. This is about figuring out where the money will be made in the new world, which is shifting. And because the Biden climate summit a couple of years ago, which saw all the world's richer countries commit to strong 2030 targets, now, especially amongst investors, there is no doubt that the future has been decided. It will be green. It's only a question of how quickly we're going to get there and who's going to be the winner and who's going to be the loser. Portugal might be a winner.
I love what you said on the future will be green and there will be winners and losers, and whoever is stuck in the past, in the past economic model, strictly tied with oil and gas, this is a dying industry. And even though there is this newborn industry, which is the renewables, understanding the new materials and the new inputs that we need to deliver this ambition. But how do we make the bridge between the old model and the new model? And I understand that Climate Bonds Initiative is supporting this shift from one model to another. How does Climate Initiative work? Is there a specific model of how do you attract capital to sustainable? How do you make business understand that the future will be green in the end?
Look, there's two things really. One is painting a picture of what will be and setting targets is incredibly valuable. Portugal has been a key player in the European Commission's Green Deal, RenewPowerEU, and so on. I've been a strong supporter of the Commission's work in this area. That's really important because that says clear direction for the industry, and capital can then plan accordingly, knowing that this is now part of policy. And the more that is certain, the more people plan in the right direction. It's a bit like if you're, going for a walk in the hills and you see a hill a long way away. You don't know how you're going to get there, but you just keep now self-correcting as you go round corners and trees. You keep using that hill as your guidance. We need those targets. That's one thing. Two is we do need strong state action in a few key areas, fiscally efficient state action. And one thing Portugal has done the last 20 years, or 15 years in particular, has been has developed a deep understanding of fiscally efficient measures in a constrained budget. We need to apply that everywhere. So that means a little bit of judicious regulation. Energy, all markets are managed, energy systems are managed. So you change the management of the system to ensure investment goes in one direction rather than up and give incentives. Central banks have work to do. Then work for greening the financial system, made up of now 120 central banks around the world, is working very hard on scenario planning and proactive measures that central banks can take to shift the economy to be more sustainable. This is because of the risks to financial stability coming through because of climate change. So there's an incentive to do something about it, if you like. To varying degrees, banks are acting. Every institution has a job to be done. The Ministry of Agriculture, for example, has a job to do to examine the nature of Portuguese and global agricultural practices and determine how we shift to address adaptation, because we're going to get changed water patterns, right? It's likely that we're going to get a significant reduction in rainfall in southern Portugal going forward. What does that mean? Let's prepare the farmers. But also to address mitigation too. How do we ensure that our agricultural practices are like that zero tilling I mentioned? How do we promote that? In Australia, 60% of farmers now use zero tilling, which is, by the way, easier and cheaper once you've got the machinery. There's a capital investment solution required. You've got to get a zero tilling machine to replace the old plough as part of it. Policy could help with this, so on. Lots and lots of things. Every ministry's got something to do in this area. The Danish government is doing a very interesting project at the moment where every single ministry has a task force looking at what they've got to do to achieve Denmark's 70% reductions by 2030 target, which is a huge challenge. In a sense, that has to happen all around the world, that kind of approach. The blended finance stuff is really important. For the investment side, it's in a sense pretty easy. Institutional investors who own most of everything on the fixed income side just have ratings levels. They need to have AAA, triple B, a certain proportion of each. We need to make sure that investors manufacture, if they get the option to switch, that is a similar risk and yield. They will, because they're very concerned about climate change. They can't manage the risk on their own because they're all individual investors. They can't take on a societal risk, but they will swap out ordinary for green. We've just got to manufacture that. How do we do that? A little bit of risk mitigation, a little bit of crowding in of private capital by the public sector, for example. The European Investment Bank, in fact, the European Bank of Reconstruction and Development is probably the world's best at doing this. We have the models there. We can apply them. And you can sort of see, we put all these things together, we could have a lot of money shifting. All that money that's sitting in negative interest rate German bonds, that's got to move to somewhere, because we're not going to pay our pensions investing in negative interest rate German bonds. So that the capital is there to be reapplied. It's looking for it. It's not after high risk. It's not going to invest in big plants in Mauritania or Tanzania very easily. It's going to need some coaching from the public sector. And that's what development banks need to do. At the moment, there's a big argument going on about reconfiguring the World Bank and other development banks to ensure they do more to crowd in private capital. Absolutely right. When you think about the development banks around the world, we have 600 national development banks, hardly any of which do any collaboration with the private sector. If we could achieve something like a a 3-to-1 leverage ratio. Every dollar of private sector invested, we get $3 of public, and we get $3 of private. That could be a huge mobilization of capital. And out of the back of that, capital will flow. It's a bit like the old days when you had a petrol car siphoning the fuel from a can. Once it gets flows, it just keeps flowing. You've just got to get the first deals out of the way. So I'm pretty confident on the capital side. I have no problem. The main issue now is the planning side. The change we've got to make in our global economy is pretty tough. It's pretty severe. We kind of got to get a planning right now. Really, the next 2 years should use a massive global effort of corporate and governments on how to plan the new economy, and then we've got to execute. Which we can execute. The tools to execute are there. Under the Portuguese government, there's been a lot of leadership here. The European Commission has really grappled with some of these issues. Yes, there's been a lot of diversion because of the Ukraine war, but they've kept a focus on the green transition. And if you look at the numbers of renewable energy investments in Europe in the last year, they've gone way up. So that's the real thing that we need to be looking at. Globally, we're beginning to see a lot of change. We see Japan engaging with transitions. We see India announcing large green hydrogen plants, very, very large. We see Saudi Arabia, a petrostate, announcing a whole city in northern Saudi Arabia, which is going to be entirely run on renewable energy. Yes, more of that, please. You can sort of see it happening. It's just it's going to happen faster now.
And so you're saying that you have both the companies and the governments having to change the ways of their working and setting clear signs to all the agents, to all the stakeholders in the market on how the future will be green. But
yes,
coming a bit to the business, because there are a lot of business that are already signaling that they want to be more green. For instance, there are some energy companies, and I'll go back to Portugal's example, EDP, who's a company that also has massive investments in the UK. They have been issuing green bonds for quite some time now, I think 4 years. But what is green bonds? Because people are used to hear about bonds. Green is just imagining that this is sustainable somehow, but how do you make something sustainable? How do you make money more sustainable, investing towards sustainable? What is green bonds?
Look, it's simple, really. It's just an investment which is green. You're borrowing the money, and you might borrow the money as a government, for example, and then you promise to use the money for protocol and reporting on green things. It's very simple. I mean, it's a bit like, you go and borrow money from your aunt to buy a car, and your aunt says, "Well, I trust you to pay it back." Okay, but can you buy an electric car? Because I think that's better for the environment. And you say, yeah, sure, of course I'm going to buy an electric car. That's essentially what's been happening. And what's more, I'm going to come back every year and take you for a drive at Christmas to show you how cool it is. That's the reporting. It's as simple as that. And because it's simple, it's grown very fast. So we now have about $2.2 trillion of green bonds around the world. It was about 2 billion when we started at climate bonds. And we have a lot of companies who are getting now a lot of benefits from issuing green bonds in terms of investor engagement, sometimes in terms of pricing. And there's a lot of incentive to do more. Typically, issuers just they do the first one, they get excited for all sorts of reasons, they just keep on doing them. That's what's happening. And that's why the market keeps growing now. So it's a very simple idea. Of course, there is the question of what is green. When we started, there was a lot of, let's just say, green bond issuance that weren't perhaps as green as we would have liked them to be. I'm not going to call them scams, because they weren't, but they were certainly confusions about what qualifies. They could have solved the confusion. They got some climate scientists in the room, but life doesn't happen as quickly as you want. So what we've done is we've developed these guidelines at the climate bonds taxonomy and now the EU taxonomy. We have clear guidance for what constitutes as green. In other words, no need to think about it now. Just have a look at the shopping list. If I go to the shops to buy something for dinner that my wife's cooking, I don't need to understand the detail because she gives me very precise instructions. Otherwise, it would be a disaster. and that works. And we now have that in place, developing around the world, and reasonable commonality about it. And its key features of that guidance are that it's 1.5 degrees Celsius aligned. You know, the difference between 1.5 degrees Celsius and 2 degrees Celsius targeting is about double the carbon budget. So the G20 in Indonesia in November confirmed 1.5 degrees is what we're focusing on. That's made it easier now to get everyone to get on the same page. And then after that, it's about making sure that the financials work. Now, it's becoming easier for energy utilities because the cost of renewables has dropped so much in the last few years. It's a bit harder in other areas, in steel, for example, or industrial sectors. That's getting there quite fast. The cost of hydrogen, in fact, thanks to renewable energy dropping cost, is becoming very cheap if it's green hydrogen. So we now have a steel plant in the Asturias being built by ArcelorMittal that's going to operate only on green hydrogen, shipped from southern Spain. Fantastic. More of that we need. Shipping as well, transport of all sorts. We've got to revolutionize the shipping industry and turn it into either hydrogen, ammonia, or bioethanol, and away from bunker fuels, which is so dirty, it's unbelievable. In fact, we've got to change fertilizers for agriculture in Portugal. We need to create them using green hydrogen to create ammonia, rather than using gas that we use now to create ammonia, which we can do now because the technology is becoming that much cheaper. So everywhere you look, there's things we need to do. The settings are coming into place. And then for businesses, it's a matter of trying to anticipate future demands. You know, if you're a Zara and you're trying to figure out what's going to sell next week, you want to look at forecasts, right? Well, I can tell you one forecast that is very much now on the minds of industrial companies around the world, which is that the future will be green. Now it's just a matter of figuring out who's going to be winners and losers and whether we can be a winner.
So coming back to the future, so what do you think are the key trends and developments that we can expect in sustainable investing besides green bonds? What will be the future? And I say this also asking about, as you said, some hard to abate industries such as steel, cement. How do they gonna transition to this green future?
Look, there are pathways for everyone. In steel, to take an example, 75% of all the blast furnaces in Europe are coming to the end of their life the next five or 6 years. We need to change them. We can't afford to rebuild them using coal as coal-fired anymore. There are three things we can do in Europe, really. One is we can substantially increase the level of recycling we do. It's hard to do in India because so much of the building is new, whereas here, we do have a whole construction cycle. We're not capturing the steel. We can double the rate of recycling. That's one. Two is we've got to shift our processes to use renewable energy. You know, we use it, just sign PPA agreements, that is power purchase agreements, or build solar plants and so on. Because there's actually quite a lot of electricity used in the steel process. That's an easy thing to do. In terms of our actual smelting, there are two things we've got to do. First is for primary, that is the creation of raw steel from iron ore, we do need to shift to green hydrogen instead of coal and not gas, which would lock us into 30 years of fossil fuel usage, with the complication that now we know that the emissions footprint of gas is actually not much better than coal because we discovered all this emissions leakage in the pipeline system, in the shipping system, and in the mining of gas, the extraction of gas. Will green hydrogen work in Europe as a base metal? Well, Europe doesn't have to create that much new steel over the next 30 years, so it's really small. What steel will be created needs to be near the hydrogen. So the Asturias ArcelorMittal plant works. But there may be a need to ship, well, in Germany, it doesn't look like creating raw steel is going to be sensible. They're better off creating iron ore pellets in Morocco or Mauritania near where a lot of green hydrogen is going to be generated because they've got lots of fields of solar power they can build, and shipping that. And then in Germany, they use electric arc furnaces to take the raw steel and make it into value-added steel. In other words, the whole steel supply chain is going to change, which it needs to, which we can in Europe because we've got so much new or end of life happening in the steel infrastructure supply chain. So I expect us to be seeing raw steel being produced in southern Europe and in Africa, and value-added stuff being done in places like Germany or France or possibly the Netherlands for things like auto part bodies. The profit you make, by the way, is in the value-added. For example, car companies, now they're all moving to electric, which is great news, have to have much stronger steel frameworks to carry that extra weight of the battery. So they've got to do more work on the quality of the steel, and that's a real skill and art, which can be done and has to be done in factories close to them because you're working closely with the end user of the steel. So those steel plants will make a lot more money in a way by doing value-added work. So you can sort of see how changes. That same thing happens everywhere. So in the cement industry, there's actually a lot we can do to drastically reduce the emissions using renewable energy, changing feedstocks and so on. In the chemicals industry, equally, we need to shift to bio feedstocks. I sat down with a chemical company in India this week who's got a fantastic asset base where they are only using bio feedstocks to create raw chemicals. They are using renewable energy in the manufacture process, and they're very conscious that in the stuff they produce, it needs to be biodegradable and not harmful. So there's the kind of pesticides, because one of the things they do is pesticides, is they're using biodegradable pesticides that are small dose. There's a whole bunch of things you can do across every company to lower your footprint dramatically. So those companies that are seizing these opportunities, we think will survive and prosper, because there's going to be a lot of pressure, both from shareholders and from consumers in the next few years. So I'm saying to everyone around the world, plan now. Plan to change your business to be future fit. Don't rely on the past as a guide. Things are, we've got a tsunami of change coming through our global economy. The next 7 years are going to be pretty amazing.
Thank you so much. And with that note, we're coming to the end of our podcast. Thank you so much. And I think that the message, plan now, because the future will be green, is a great way of finalizing this conversation. Thank you so much for this truly enlightening conversation. And we appreciate your insights and recommendation you shared today with us. And I thank you for your participation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Flavia.